In fact, it feels a little bit like speed dating almost, trying to get through everything in time. So thank you guys for having me. This is my first NEDAS as well. I saw a lot of people are in the same boat, so it's good to be here. Fascinating group of people. I've already met several of you this morning. So I'm going to try to get through a fair amount during the next 25 minutes, and I would also like to keep time for questions. And in fact, since this is New York, maybe one way to handle it is to shout out a question if you have a question while I'm going along, rather than waiting for the end. Although I do know there are some logistics with the microphones, so it may not be quite as easy to shout out questions as it should be. But as I'm going along, if you have a question, let me know. So I can gauge where we all stand before I start. Who here is intimately familiar with CBRS already? Okay, so we do have a few very familiar. Who have heard of CBRS but aren't, totally familiar with what it is and could use a little bit? Okay, similar number. And then who's never heard of CBRS at all? Okay, that's good. That means at least we're doing our job getting the publicity out there. Let me give a very quick background on what CBRS is. For those intimately familiar with it, you probably already know, but for those that are less familiar with, there are some important characteristics of CBRS that make it different from any other type of wireless service. The biggest difference is this is a shared spectrum initiative. So CBRS is a wireless service that operates in spectrum that it is not the only occupant of that spectrum. In fact, very importantly, the other occupant of the spectrum is the US DoD. They have guns and tanks and all sorts of other things, so we have to respect them, we have to protect them from interference. And so this is a shared opportunity to use spectrum when the DoD isn't using it. The other important thing about CBRS is that there's two different tiers of service in CBRS. If you want interference protection and you want some assurance that you'll be able to access the band and use it for your in-building system or outside small cell network or whatever, you can buy a license. It's called a priority access license or a PAL. The FCC is going to auction those licenses. We just heard yesterday that the auction is going to be June 25th of next year. So those licenses will be available about a year from now. But a really important thing is if you don't want to pay for a license, you can actually access CBRS spectrum for free. You don't necessarily get all the interference assurances and protections that you do if you're a PAL, but you also don't have to pay any money for it. You can use up to 150 megahertz of spectrum, which could provide multi-hundred megabit type service without paying a cent for the spectrum. And there's a large ecosystem of equipment already available, and I'll mention some of the numbers a little bit later. So it's almost like for free, virtually for free, spectrum-wise, you could start up your own wireless service. So instead of a DAS rebroadcasting some other wireless company's service in a building, you can start up your own wireless service in that building. And with appropriate roaming agreements and things in place, you can be the wireless service provider in your set of commercial real estate or residential buildings or whatever. So it's a very unique opportunity. Did you have a question or? No, good. Okay. So it's important to understand the distinction of CBRS from other wireless services. Keep in mind that the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, when they want to offer commercial wireless service, they go out, they spend billions of dollars on dedicated spectrum in order just as a beginning, just to be able to access the spectrum and provide services. CBRS is a completely different model where you can go out and get the spectrum relatively cheaply or even free, depending on which tier of service you want to work from. So we think it's going to be a disruptor in the wireless services. We'll see. It's about to launch, and I'll say a few words about that shortly, about when CBRS will get going. But we think it'll be a disruptor. We think it'll be a critical complement or even change to the way that DAS services are offered, for example, or small cells are deployed. We think the opportunities are pretty tremendous. Just a couple of things of nomenclature. A base station in CBRS is called a CBSD, which stands for Citizens Broadband Radio Service Device. That's what we call an actual base station. And an end user device, a user device, is called an end user device or EUD. So you might hear me use those terms here in a minute. I just want to make sure that you know what those mean. The other important component of CBRS, which differs from other wireless services, including Wi-Fi, for example, is that in order to make all of this work and to make sure we don't interfere with the DoD when we use the band, all of the CBSDs have to be under positive control of what's called a spectrum access system, or a SAS. So before a CBSD can transmit, before you can bring your base station on the air, it connects briefly to a SAS and says, here I am, and this is what I want to do. Am I okay? And the SAS says, yep, based on where you are, you're not going to cause interference. Go ahead. And that CBSD has to connect back to the SAS on a regular basis to make sure it's still okay to transmit. And the reason for that is that the DoD's use is for radars on ships, and those radars don't operate all the time. They pop up in locations and times that are unpredictable. They don't tell us in advance for obvious reasons. We have to sense their presence. And when they pop up in a coastal region, for example, near New York or something, we have to inform the CBSDs in those areas, hey, switch to a different channel, or do some other reconfiguration so that you won't interfere with the DoD. So right now, commercially, there are 6 entities that are going to be SAS providers. There's not just one SAS. It's a competitive marketplace to reduce the cost to the end user. But there are 6 companies: Amdocs, CommScope, Federated Wireless, Google, Sony, and another small company called KeyBridge. So those are the current 6 spectrum access system providers. As you notice, Google's one of those. So that gets me to the point is, what is Google's interest in all of this? If you look at the statistics, worldwide, about 50% of internet traffic is handled by mobile devices, is handled through mobile connections. If you look in the US, that number is even bigger. And it depends on how you ask the question, but roughly 65% or so of internet traffic is through mobile devices. Mobile devices, of course, obviously rely on spectrum to operate. The only way you can operate a mobile device is if you have the radio spectrum to operate. It's got to be wireless, so you're operating on the radio spectrum. So radio spectrum becomes a critical component in mobile internet access. And mobile internet access is the majority of internet access. And Google, being an internet company, obviously wants to make it easier for more people to get connected to the internet. So spectrum has become a priority issue for Google. Now, the challenge, I'm a spectrum person, I don't know how many others here are spectrum people, but the challenge with spectrum is they're not making any more of it. And what we do have is generally highly occupied already. So our opportunities for greenfield spectrum in order to deploy new wireless services is diminishing. So we're now in an environment where if you want to offer a new wireless service, you generally have to go into a band where people are already operating, and you have to find ways to share that spectrum. CBRS is the first big-scale commercial deployment of shared spectrum under this type of arrangement. So we think it's a model for many future uses of shared spectrum, and shared spectrum is becoming critically important. So Google is very interested in finding ways to make spectrum sharing work. So as a SAS administrator is one. But another interest of Google is, purely from a commercial point of view, we also have databases that make that are second to none in terms of enabling wireless services. One of the things we offer are network planning tools that takes, if you use Google Earth or Google Maps, you know that we have in many cities, hopefully most cities, before too long, we have very detailed databases of building polygons. We even know where every tree is. We're now building polygons of the trees themselves. We know where all of these things are that impact radio propagation and determine how your coverage is going to exist. We also have in-building mapping solutions that are being developed that can very accurately determine the size and shapes of indoor spaces and also be able to predict radio propagation indoors. So we have network planning tools that draw upon our geodatabases that are better than anyone else's out there at the moment. And of course, we hope that others join us. So in a way, the state of our knowing of clutter, like buildings and foliage and things that impact radio propagation in urban and suburban areas, is sort of like, the state of terrain databases were, 10 or 20 years ago. And as we go on, terrain databases are becoming increasingly sophisticated and detailed. And we're seeing the same thing happen with clutter data. And that clutter data can be just as important, and in fact, in cities, much more important to radio propagation than terrain or any other factors. And so we're hoping to leverage that in our advanced network planning tool. We're all in on CBRS. Our former chairman, Eric Schmidt, was the co-chair of the Obama Presidential Committee that came up with this concept for spectrum sharing. We participated very heavily in the FCC's proceeding to develop CBRS and develop rules that could facilitate the spectrum sharing the way that we envision it. We stood up the Wireless Innovation Forum's standards committee that developed the standards for CBRS, and we also stood up the CBRS Alliance, which is a business-focused industry group that's grown to about 143 members as of this week. We started it 2.5 years ago. It's now up to 143 corporate members that are looking at the 4G LTE and 5G applications in the CBRS band, developing business use cases, and then developing whatever standards are necessary to make those use cases work. So this is a work in progress, by the way. If you have any interest in any thought that you're going to deploy CBRS in your business, there's still time to shape the business opportunities for CBRS and the standards that support those business opportunities. So I would encourage you to look into the CBRS Alliance if you have any interest in the business opportunities by CBRS. And if CBRS lives up to its promise in disrupting or modifying the DAS and small cell industry, you probably want to be part of the conversation and discussing how things go. Where does CBRS stand? We are anticipating that the FCC is going to issue a public notice any day now authorizing initial commercial deployment to begin for CBRS. We started down this road back in 2012. That was the first notice of proposed rulemaking from the FCC. This was a fast track band for the FCC, and here we are 7 years later. We're just getting to commercial service. I'd hate to see how long it takes for a band that's not on the fast track to get adopted, but we are close to commercial service. There have been some bumps and challenges along the way. Dealing with the DoD is always challenging, but we are getting very close to initial commercial deployment. We have a big kickoff event for the beginning of initial commercial deployment of CBRS scheduled for 2 weeks from yesterday. So the September 18th in Washington, D.C. At a hotel that happens to be right next door to the FCC, we are holding a kickoff event for the beginning of commercial deployment of CBRS. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the auction for the priority access licenses for CBRS is not going to happen until June 25th of 2020. Initial commercial service in CBRS until about a year from now will all be in that lower level tier, the general authorized access or GAA tier. So it's free spectrum access. And in fact, it'll be interesting. We'll have a year's experience of authorizing CBRS applications on the free tier, and if that works out well, it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the price of licenses in the PAL auction. Because if everything seems to be working well under the free tier, the GAA tier, it's not clear, who and what will want to pay money to get PAL licenses. The PAL licenses, by the way, another benefit in CBRS is they're offered in small service areas. They're offered in county-sized service areas. So if you're a rural broadband provider, for example, or you just have a limited market, or you want to build up a particularly shaped market, you can bid on the licenses on a county-by-county basis. And this is why they're not going to cost $1 billion, because you're not getting a nationwide license. And each of them is 10 megahertz chunk. You can get up to 40, an individual licensee can get up to 40 megahertz total in a particular license area. So you have that particular flexibility in order to get PAL licenses. But initially, for the first year or so, it'll be under the free license model. So about the equipment ecosystem, this is probably as important as anything else. It's as important as the spectrum access. So let me just kind of clarify the equipment description. So the CBRS Alliance specializes in 3GPP-based deployments of CBRS. And so that means 4G LTE and 5G NR. Those are the international standards created by 3GPP. That's what the CBRS Alliance is based upon. The CBRS Alliance has gone an extra step and has created a trademark called ONGO, O-N-G-O, that is a specific type of 4G LTE or 5G NR. So you can get equipment certified not just with the FCC as CBRS capable, but you can also go to CBRS Alliance and get it ONGO certified. And ONGO is an assurance that your equipment is compatible with all other ONGO equipment, so you can think of it as sort of the Wi-Fi brand of 802.11. ONGO is CBRS Alliance brand of CBRS. And you can get your equipment certified as being compatible with all other ONGO equipment. So that's just a little distinction when I go to the ecosystem. So right now there are, if you go to the FCC's equipment authorization database, there's 140 total devices that have been certified for CBRS operations, which, considering CBRS hasn't even been commercially deployed yet, it's a pretty good total. Those 140 devices are split among CBSDs and among end user devices, EUDs, and also with embedded chipsets and things. So it's split among many of those. So ONGO certification specifically, so CBRS Alliance certified, there's 14 different models of CBSDs currently available, and those are from Acceleran, Blink, Ericsson, Nokia, Ruckus, Sercom, and Telrad. There are additional devices available that have been FCC certified but are not ONGO certified, either because they don't use 4G LTE, or they're not going for ONGO certification, or the ONGO certification is in process, or for whatever reason are not FCC or not ONGO certified. Now, as far as end user devices, the very first end user device is this. This is Google's Pixel 3. This was a mid-year release of the Pixel 3. We released this in February. It is the first user device, first phone that supports CBRS. So this phone is CBRS capable. It was followed quickly by devices from Samsung and others. So there are now multiple phones that support CBRS, and there's also multiple other types of devices that support CBRS. Ours was the first, so I have to mention that. This particular, the Google 3, the Pixel 3 is locked to Verizon, but Pixel 4 comes out next month, and it will be an unlocked version. So it will support CBRS from any carrier, and coming out basically just in time for the beginning of commercial CBRS service. So very exciting. But there are FCC certified, there's 36 different models of devices and embedded modules that have been certified. So the ecosystem is there, the spectrum is free, we're ready to deploy. The business models, as I mentioned earlier, are still sort of in flux. It's like, make what you want of it. You go to CBRS Alliance and you have a business use case, you can help develop the standards that will support that business use case. I can tell you from participating in CBRS Alliance and chairing some of the committees, one of the key focus areas, not the only one, there's many different business opportunities in CBRS, but one of the key areas is private LTE networks. And a lot of it has to do with in-building coverage. CBRS sort of seems to be designed for in-building type of coverage. The idea is to develop very cost-effective neutral host type solutions for in-building coverage that, and I'm afraid to say, could replace DAS. Don't throw anything at me. I'm just saying that's one of the options. Or be a complement, or as DAS providers is a kind of thing that is worth looking at. So the idea would be, and this is a highly simplified view of it, but the idea would be if you as a network provider, you set up a CBRS network provider yourself, you deploy it in a suite of commercial real estate environments or residential environments, you have roaming agreements with the carriers, you then are able, because CBRS is operating as a 4G LTE network and soon to be 5G NR, you're able to seamlessly roam from carrier networks into the building and just switch automatically, voice calls, data calls, whatever. None of this fumbling for changing from LTE to Wi-Fi or whatever. It's a seamless transition, and everyone that's operating in your building gets it. And your backhaul is just just a regular internet connection. So you're not putting donor antennas on the roof and running tons of cables and things like that. It's a very simple solution. It seems to be the holy grail of a lot of people who are focused in the CBRS Alliance. But also private LTE networks that aren't necessarily roaming complements to macro networks, but instead are private networks operated by commercial real estate or hospitality industry or whatever in their own buildings. So those are two of those are some of the big use cases we have for indoor. There's also a lot of companies interested in CBRS for outdoor coverage. You're allowed much higher power for outdoor coverage. In the CBRS Alliance, and companies that plan to deploy CBRS are Verizon, AT&T, Charter, Comcast, the big cable companies, but also there's lots and lots of smaller providers and smaller interest in CBRS Alliance, and there's a lot of rural broadband providers that are interested in using this for rural broadband. So there's a lot of interest among a lot of different communities. The membership in CBRS Alliance spans just about every type of industry player, vendors and operators and everything there. So it's a very robust ecosystem. The train has left the station. It's going to happen. It's not going to be a TV white space thing where the infrastructure just never materializes. And just a quick word on 5G. The CBRS band has been identified as a 5G band by 3GPP, so it is officially a 5G NR band. It's called N48. And CBRS Alliance is developing 5G standards specifically for CBRS, and we expect those standards to be done before the end of the year. So CBRS will fully support 5G. Because there's only 150 megahertz available and that's shared, we don't expect CBRS to be a standalone 5G band, at least early on. We expect it to be sort of a complement, non-standalone 5G band, but it will certainly be a component of 5G. And for those of you, looking at, millimeter wave versus anything else, if you look at the Defense Innovation Board report that came out a little while ago, back in April, that relied a lot on some studies we did at Google, millimeter wave is a really, really expensive way of deploying 5G, and we do not see that we can competitively offer substantial 5G coverage to a substantial fraction of the population using millimeter waves. The coverage just isn't there, and the expense makes it challenging economically. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's a big challenge. So quickly on the future, I just want to leave a couple of a little bit of time for questions. We see the spectrum access systems evolving and being able to use much more complex network planning tools and propagation tools that Google is developing. So we see CBRS developing. Once we get it out there, we prove that it works, we prove we don't interrupt with the military and the DoD, we see CBRS evolving to a much more sophisticated network where we're able to take into account that you're inside an energy efficient building and your signal is not going to interfere with a signal that's outside of the building, those types of things. So we really see the evolution of the SASs after this first wave, and once we show that we're not going to interfere with the military, we see that evolving into very sophisticated ways, and we see applications of the SAS to other bands, 3.7 to 4.2, the C-band to 3.45 to 3.55 to 6 gigahertz, lots of other applications for SAS. So stand by. This is just sort of the beginning of all of this, and I think we have a lot of room for innovation. And hopefully in a couple of weeks you'll start to hear early results of what the CBRS deployments have been like, because we're starting soon. So I think we've got just a very short time for some questions, and good. And I think you have to wait for a microphone.
Let me just run your way.
Yeah.
There we go. So I went over on this side.
Yeah. Oop. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for sharing those insights.
Sure.
I have a question about the international scale-out capability of CBRS. Do you foresee that this could actually be successful in other markets outside the U.S.?
Right. So great question. Everybody's sort of waiting to see how it works here. We've heard that from many regulators. They're waiting to see how the concept works here before they go. However, I know in the UK, for example, they're starting to become, we're going over there and discussing in detail how this is working. In Japan as well. Sony is one of our SAS administrators, Japanese-based company. So we see a tremendous amount of interest from other countries in this, but a big kind of let's wait and see how it plays out in the US and make sure it doesn't interfere first. Yep.
Hi, Andrew.
Yep.
So most devices are not CBRS compatible right now?
Right now, yes. But, most people kind of refresh their devices on short timescales. I know that there are a lot of major devices that have not announced, that I'm not allowed to say, are deploying CBRS in their devices. So we expect that to change soon. But at the moment, we've got Motorola, Samsung, Google, and I know I'm going to forget some other things, but also Sierra Wireless is making a tremendous number of modules available for IoT devices. So we expect a lot of devices very shortly to have it built in. But in the meantime, buy a Pixel phone, and then we'll,
Yeah, quick question. How
Yep.
big a deal is the military use potential interference considered? Because in New York Harbor, for example, there's Navy
Right.
ships, planes, I'm sure turning on the radars all the time.
Right. So this radar, it's a specific radar. It's on 19 aircraft carriers because that's all they have. So there's 19 aircraft carriers in the world. Each of them have one of these radars. The biggest activity is in the Norfolk and San Diego areas. That's where the greatest concentration of carriers are. It'll be a factor during Fleet Week in New York, but outside of Fleet Week, we don't expect it to be much of a factor. We have sensors deployed along the coast. I can tell you north of San Francisco, one of our sensors there only sees an activation on one channel every 2 months or so. We also have a sensor in Norfolk that's going off on any given, it's going off on one channel basically every day. So it's going to depend on where you are, and then how far that impacts things. It depends on how many users there are, but basically there's a neighborhood of, it could be 100 kilometers or so where you won't have to shut off, you'll just have to be moved to another channel, and that's seamless to the user. Our SAS does that, tells the CBSD to move to another channel. It's seamless to the user, you shouldn't even recognize it. We think instances of actually recognizable disruption to your CBRS service should be very rare.
Thank you.
Yes.
With regards to indoor indoor CBRS,
Right.
Does the architecture look similar to Wi-Fi? Comparable,
Right.
instead of like what a traditional DAS, system might look like?
Right. So that's a really good question. Everybody says, well, what about Wi-Fi? So we're looking at it from a couple of perspectives. And Wi-Fi is a great solution, especially with Wi-Fi 6 coming soon. Wi-Fi is a great solution in a lot of cases. We're looking in the indoor case, it's the seamless roaming between LTE networks and voice calls and things like that we see as one of the important things. We also see sort of the security of LTE compared to Wi-Fi, although the Wi-Fi security is getting better. We see that as sort of one of the key differentiators between CBRS and deployment of Wi-Fi. In outdoor small cell applications, CBRS is allowed much more, 12 times more power than Wi-Fi. So you've got better coverage in outdoor environments than you do with Wi-Fi. And also, the CBRS band is lower in frequency than the 5 gigahertz, the broadest bandwidth Wi-Fi band. And so the indoor penetration is a little bit better, and the outdoor coverage is a little bit better than 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So it's differentiated. I won't stand up here and say that you should switch everything from Wi-Fi to CBRS. There's going to be cases where Wi-Fi is a better choice.
So my question really was more about what the look and feel of the equipment is. Does it look more like Wi-Fi equipment?
Oh.
What distributed antenna system equipment?
Yeah, so it looks like, so the access point and yeah, exactly.
Access point.
Yeah, the access point looks like a Wi-Fi. In fact, I have experimenting with some Ruckus access points. They're the typical footprint that you see for a Wi-Fi access point. And they're, Ethernet backhaul, same kind of thing. So, but you don't have to wire up to antennas on the roof or anything like that. So it will be as easy to deploy as Wi-Fi. Right. So given that, yes, you should use CBRS everywhere and take all your Wi-Fi out and everything. Actually, I think realistically the boxes will have combinations of Wi-Fi and CBRS built in.
All right, we're going to head back over here to the side.
You mentioned voice.
Yes.
If you're an enterprise and you select one of these vendors for the access points, the CBSDs, and you deploy a private LTE network, how are you going to get voice calls that go back, if you're a Verizon subscriber?
Right. So that's a really good question. So we have, there's back infrastructure to all of this as well. So for example, Google, Ruckus and others, they all operate EPCs and network management systems and things like that do all of the back-end interfaces in order to handle the call routing and things. But also, a lot of the calls are over the top these days, and so all they care about is an internet connection. They don't care necessarily about voice routing in the traditional sense of things like that. So it's sort of a combination of, if you're doing a private LTE network, you'd establish a relationship with a network management system and with an EPC on the back end in order to handle the traditional voice calls, if you wanted to do that. But also the Verizons and the AT&Ts of the world themselves are looking at in-building CBRS as well. So it may not even be a neutral host roaming situation. You may actually be going to their systems themselves or installing their systems there. So, I mean, there's just a variety of ways to handle voice and data seamlessly.
Thank you. You talked the importance of data, vector data.
Yep.
You talked in regards to the buildings.
Yep.
The relationship between outdoor and indoor when you're looking at the design and the handoff between that.
Right.
Two things there. How's Google looking at that? Secondly, is building material a factor in that?
It is. So, the outdoor-indoor is becoming more of an issue because of the high efficiency building materials that's being used. It used to be you sort of gracefully hand off from indoors to outdoors as you went deeper into the building. But today what we're seeing is, sort of like you close the door behind you and it's like you're in an RF chamber. The high efficiency glass is usually metal coated or metal infused, and it causes tremendous attenuation. My wife works for a company that owns 20 apartment buildings in the DC area. And their first building that they rebuilt recently, when they opened it up, the first thing they noticed was no cell service in the lobby. People come to rent, and they notice that their cell phones don't work. It's a tremendous thing. So they've looked at DAS solutions and things, and DAS works great, but it's expensive. They got quotes up to $200,000 for a 100-unit apartment complex, so it's very expensive. As far as the handoff between indoors and outdoors, so Google's not a wireless network provider itself. We've got network planning tools that take advantage of our geodata. We have spectrum access system for CBRS. We have other spectrum-related tools, but we're not a network provider ourselves. So we're typically not dealing on the RF side. But our network planning tools, I can't discuss too much about what's being incorporated in the future, but I can tell you that our geodatabases are beginning to be able to recognize not just the building shapes, but the building materials that are used for the buildings. That's sort of in its infancy, but it's being developed. And so we'll have better predictors of where you will have issues with in-building coverage that may be more dramatic than other areas. And we're starting to build solutions around some of those things. So we'll be better at predicting the issues, but we're not, on an RF perspective, we're not personally dealing with the RF handoff issues.